Berlin, winter 1943. The snow outside the Reich main security office falls soundlessly, a white curtain over a city that no longer breathes freely. Inside, the air smells of paper, ink, and fear. Rows of clerks type names onto deportation lists, columns of fate, organized by district, religion, and transport number. Every letter hammered into the page is another family marked for resettlement. At one of these desks sits a man in a gray uniform, his collar bearing the double lightning insignia of the SS. His pen hovers over a file marked Dr. Samuel Hirsch, aged 47, to be transported to Theresienstadt. The order is routine, a bureaucratic step in a machine designed for efficiency, not conscience. But this man doesn't stamp the paper, not yet. He adjusts his glasses, leans closer, and quietly changes a date. Transport delayed, medical exemption pending. Then, with a deliberate, almost reverent motion, he presses his seal into the ink pad and marks the document with the eagle and swastika. The life of Dr. Hirsch, at least for now, is spared. No one notices. The office hums on, indifferent. The man places the file into the deferred stack, alongside dozens of others marked with similar notes. Special review, incomplete documentation, further verification required. Each of these minor delays hides the same truth. A quiet act of rebellion disguised as procedure. Outside the building, the city groans under Allied bombardment. Trains leave daily for the camps, their whistles echoing through frozen streets. And yet, somewhere within this labyrinth of paperwork, one Nazi officer is fighting back, not with guns or speeches, but with stamps, signatures, and silence. His name, largely forgotten today, will not appear in propaganda, nor in memorials. But the documents he altered, misplaced, or delayed would one day tell a story the Reich never intended to preserve. When most people imagine Nazi Germany, they picture soldiers, tanks, and rallies. But the real power of the Third Reich didn't lie on the battlefield. It lived in the offices, the ministries, the departments. Inside these walls, genocide was reduced to paperwork. Every order, every deportation, every confiscation began the same way, with a form. An Antrag for exemption, a Bescheinigung for relocation, a transport list for trains leaving Berlin. The Nazi regime weaponized administrative precision, what the philosopher Hannah Arendt later called the banality of evil. Ordinary clerks, secretaries, and file keepers became cogs in a moral vacuum, performing tasks so small and procedural they could almost forget what the papers meant. The Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, a bureaucratic fortress of files and fear, oversaw it all. Within its section Fruby 4, under Adolf Eichmann, transport schedules were drawn up with military efficiency. Each week, thousands of names flowed down the chain of command, compiled by local police, cross-checked by census data, and verified by regional offices. Every correct signature meant another person was trapped. Every missing stamp, every ambiguous note, a potential lifeline. And that's where our protagonist operated. He was a mid-level civil servant in uniform, one of thousands absorbed into the SS's administrative ranks. He wasn't on the front lines, nor at the camps. His battlefield was a desk, and his weapon, the knowledge of how the system truly worked. He understood the unspoken law of survival within Nazi bureaucracy. Paper moves slower than orders. A file misplaced could delay a transport. A misfiled name could vanish into administrative purgatory. A single line of bureaucratic jargon, further investigation required, could hold back the Gestapo for weeks. By 1943, the system was cracking under its own weight. Bombings destroyed archives, refugees flooded cities, departments lost track of their own paperwork. Amid this chaos, he saw an opening, a narrow path between obedience and sabotage. While others saw ink and forms, he saw shields, and he began to use them. This was not mercy. It was method, a way to fight the inhumanity of the system using its own language. Before the war, he was a civil servant, quiet, punctual, invisible. Born in Hamburg in 1901, he had come of age during Germany's economic collapse after World War I. Like many in his generation, he believed in order, Paperwork, hierarchy, regulation, these things gave shape to a world that felt like chaos. He joined the civil administration in the early 1930s, well before the SS insignia adorned his collar. His specialty: personnel and transport records, numbers, schedules, and names. It was tedious, steady work. And when the Nazis rose to power, it was precisely this kind of man the regime sought: obedient, efficient, unquestioning. By 1938, he was promoted to a post in Berlin's Department of Population Registry, a branch that fed data into the Gestapo's identification system. His new desk sat beneath a portrait of Hitler, and his orders came stamped with the Reich's seal. He wasn't an ideologue. He wasn't even particularly political. He was, as one historian would later describe him, a functionary swept along by history. But something shifted. In early 1941, during the first deportations from Hamburg, he witnessed a Jewish neighbor, a retired teacher named Marta Loewenstein, being forced from her apartment. She had once tutored him in Latin as a boy. That night, as her name appeared on the transport list crossing his desk, he froze. He knew the train numbers. He knew where they led. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, that the lines of ink he moved each day were ending in gas and ash. It is believed that this moment, the intersection of memory and duty, broke something in him. From then on, small irregularities began to appear in his reports. A missing signature here, a clerical note there. Files delayed for further verification. Deportation orders returned due to incorrect birth records. To his superiors, it was normal bureaucratic friction. To those whose names appeared on those pages, it was a miracle. He began to develop a system of coded compassion, a way to manipulate the machinery of persecution without attracting notice. He learned which officers were too lazy to double-check documents, which offices were overburdened, and how to bury problem cases in endless correspondence between departments. The key was invisibility. In the Third Reich, loud dissent meant death. Quiet resistance, hidden in ink, could survive. At home, his wife noticed the change. He became withdrawn, cautious, often staring at the radio in silence as bulletins announced new victories on the Eastern Front. He never spoke of what he was doing, but she remembered one sentence, whispered once at the kitchen table: "If I can't stop the machine, maybe I can jam it." The war rages outside, but his rebellion is quiet, buried in paperwork, a whisper against a hurricane. By late 1942, the machinery of extermination was running at full speed. Deportations from across occupied Europe reached their peak, yet within the sterile corridors of the Reich's population office, a single man began to quietly disrupt the rhythm of death, not through sabotage, but through paperwork. His strategy was simple, almost elegant: delay, confuse, and misfile. He knew the Nazi bureaucracy was a behemoth that demanded absolute precision. Every transport required dozens of forms, stamped, dated, confirmed by multiple departments. So he began to exploit its own complexity against itself. He would mark deportation files with ambiguous phrases, further review required. Awaiting confirmation from Vienna. Transport list inconsistent with census data. Each phrase meant nothing, and everything. A single misplaced comma could halt a transport for weeks. A minor discrepancy in a date could force another round of approvals. A missing birth certificate could create an endless paper chase between Berlin and regional offices. The SS thrived on speed and certainty. He introduced slowness and doubt. Over time, he expanded his quiet methods. He began collaborating, though unknowingly, with others who shared a similar instinct. A secretary in a district office who lost a registry book, a railway clerk who misread orders, a typist who replaced an R with an N in a surname, erasing someone from a transport list. These weren't organized resistors. They were people surviving within the system. But their micro-acts formed a fragile web of unintended humanity. Historians later found evidence of entire deportation lists that vanished or were returned for correction. One file bore his handwriting beside a bold note: "Subject relocated to essential war labor. Retain until further notice." That phrase saved dozens. Essential war labor exempted Jews temporarily needed for factory production, a loophole in Hitler's genocidal efficiency. He used it repeatedly, buying time for families who, by chance, crossed his desk. Still, this was a deadly game. Every document he touched was traceable. Every unexplained delay could invite suspicion. One afternoon, a Gestapo liaison officer confronted him over a set of deferred files. "Why are these names still here?" "Awaiting confirmation," he replied without blinking. "The records from Prague are incomplete." The officer grunted, annoyed, and moved on. The lie worked, that time. But word of his inefficiency began to spread. He was moved to a smaller office, further from direct supervision, ironically giving him more autonomy to continue his secret work. As Allied bombers thundered overhead and the Reich tightened its grip, he turned the bureaucratic machine into a shield made of paper and ink. By early 1944, it's estimated, based on surviving files, that his interventions delayed or obscured over 250 deportations, some permanently. Not through rebellion, not through courage as we usually define it, but through administrative sabotage, a rebellion so quiet the war barely noticed it happening. Late at night, he seals another envelope, the sound of sirens faint in the distance. His hand trembles for the first time. He knows every false signature could be the one that ends him. By the summer of 1944, Berlin was cracking. Allied bombers carved scars across the city's skyline, the smell of smoke mixed with ink and fear. Inside the offices of the Reich Main Security Office, morale was collapsing. Efficiency, once the Nazi god, was fading under exhaustion, suspicion, and bureaucratic chaos. But that same chaos was now turning against him. A review commission from the Gestapo had begun auditing deportation paperwork, searching for irregularities. They were hunting for errors, falsifications, any sign of sabotage through administration. And his files contained many. It began with a single question. A young SS inspector named Franz Holz noticed multiple transport lists marked pending or deferred. The reasons were vague, the handwriting inconsistent. Holtz reported the anomaly to his superior. Within a week, 2 Gestapo agents appeared at his office. "You have a high number of delayed transfers," one said, tapping a folder. "Explain why these haven't been cleared." He kept his tone calm. "We are awaiting confirmation from the regional offices. Some records were destroyed in the bombings." A pause. The agents exchanged glances. One of them scribbled something on a notepad and said quietly, "Be careful, Herr Obersturmbannführer. Inconsistency is the enemy of order." That night, he didn't go home. He stayed late, reviewing his files, burning notes, rewriting margins. The walls of the office felt closer than ever. Every drawer could now be evidence. He realized the cruel paradox of his defiance. The very system he had used to save lives could now sentence him with the same efficiency. In September 1944, a colleague, a clerk named Greta Wessel, one of the few who suspected his quiet rebellion, warned him that Holtz had requested access to all delayed files. Greta herself had been falsifying entries for Jewish children hidden under false identities. She knew the danger well. Together they devised a desperate plan. That night, during an air raid blackout, they moved several stacks of incriminating documents to the lower archives, mixing them with inactive records from 1939. As bombs fell outside, the two of them worked silently by candlelight, reshuffling the fates of hundreds. Each file misplaced was another name buried, not in death, but in bureaucratic oblivion. The next morning, Holtz returned to find the files missing. The clerk on duty blamed the bomb damage. Parts of the storage room had collapsed. Holtz filed a report, but dropped the investigation weeks later. There were larger crises now. The Red Army was advancing. Berlin itself was becoming a battlefield. He had survived discovery, but barely. Every day from then on was a performance. The perfect bureaucrat, efficient, expressionless, obedient. But behind that mask, he was exhausted. He had seen too many names, too many lives reduced to paper. He knew the war was lost, and that when the collapse came, no amount of ink would protect him. March 1945. The office windows rattle with distant explosions. He looks over one last file, a family marked for resettlement. He hesitates, then stamps it invalid. The camera lingers on his hand. It shakes slightly as he sets down the seal. For the first time, there is no satisfaction, only a question. Will any of this matter? Berlin, April 1945. The city is unrecognizable, a wasteland of smoke, rubble, and echoes of the Reich's final madness. In the collapsing bureaucratic core of Hitler's empire, the paperwork continues, though now it serves no purpose. Our protagonist sits in what remains of his office, windows shattered, shelves half toppled. The air reeks of damp paper and gunpowder. The typewriters are silent. Yet one final transport order lands on his desk, the last he will ever see. It's a list of 63 names, all marked for immediate transfer from Berlin to Theresienstadt. Among them, Martha Loewenstein, his old neighbor, somehow still alive, somehow still caught in the web. He stares at the file for a long time. Outside, artillery thunders closer. Soviet tanks are only miles away. The Reich is finished, but the Gestapo still hunts traitors. Burning the document could expose him. Approving it would condemn her. And so he hesitates. Through the cracked walls, he hears a voice. Greta Wessel, the secretary who stood by him these past months. They're evacuating the building tonight. The SS are destroying files. He nods slowly. Then, without speaking, he pulls a red pencil from his drawer, the one used for cancellations, and draws a bold diagonal line across the deportation order. Canceled, subject already relocated, unconfirmed. It's a lie that no one will ever verify. He stamps it, signs it, and places it at the bottom of a stack of completed documents, where it will vanish beneath chaos and retreat. That single act, one file among thousands, becomes his final defiance. Moments later, shouting echoes in the hallway. Gestapo officers are moving through the offices, destroying evidence, seizing suspect employees. Greta slips into his room, her face pale. They're checking every desk. If they find your notes, then it's over, he says quietly. Or Ming? They'll shoot you. He smiles faintly. Better me than 63 others. Minutes later, 2 Gestapo men burst in. He stands as they accuse him of obstruction of deportation orders and clerical misconduct under wartime law. He doesn't deny it. He simply says, if your system were perfect, you wouldn't need men like me to fix it. One of them strikes him. The rest of what happens is uncertain. No record survives of his interrogation, no official note of his fate. When Allied troops entered Berlin weeks later, his office was ash and paper dust. But one document did survive, the canceled transport list bearing his red diagonal mark. In the margins, in faint pencil, were 2 words, für sie, for her. Stacks of charred files scattered through the streets, among them the fragments of a war fought not with bullets, but with bureaucracy, and one man's conscience hidden in red ink. May 1945. Berlin has become a graveyard of stone and smoke. The Reich's banners lie trampled in the streets, their colors dulled by dust and blood. As Soviet troops advance through the city, the war is over in all but name. In the ruins of government buildings, the paperwork of death litters the floors. Deportation lists, orders, memos, forms stamped Geheim, and among them, one surviving ledger from the population office, pages half burned, bearing notes in a familiar hand. The man who once controlled those papers is gone, presumed dead or executed during the final days. No body is found, no record of trial, only absence. When Allied investigators begin cataloging the mountains of Nazi documents, their first priority is identifying war criminals. They expect to find lists of perpetrators, not evidence of mercy. But in the wreckage of the SS archives, they discover anomalies. Dozens of transport lists marked canceled, pending, medical exemption, or essential labor. In total, more than 400 names that should have been deported, but never were. Some of those names surface again months later among survivors liberated from Theresienstadt, Bergen-Belsen, and underground shelters in Berlin. When questioned how they escaped deportation, their answers echo the same pattern. Our paperwork never came through. They said my file was incomplete. Someone in Berlin delayed the order. The Allies assume it's confusion, administrative failure amid collapse. But one British investigator, Captain Edward Harrison, begins noticing a recurring signature, a faint looping mark on multiple deferred files. He traces it back to a single office, a single name, Obersturmbannführer, name redacted in the file, the man who vanished before surrender. Harrison writes in his field notes, the evidence suggests at least one Nazi official acted intentionally to delay deportations. Motive unclear. Possibly ideological deviation or moral interference. It's the first written acknowledgement, hidden deep in a 1946 intelligence report, that not every cog in Hitler's bureaucracy turned willingly. Meanwhile, survivors begin returning to Berlin. Among them is Martha Loewenstein, the retired teacher whose file he last touched. She finds her apartment bombed, her family gone. But when she visits the local records office to obtain post-war documents, an archivist shows her something uncanny, a copy of her old deportation order crossed out in red. She weeps. Who did this? She asks. No one knows. The name on the signature line is half burned, the ink faded. All she can do is whisper, "Someone remembered me." As the years pass, the man's existence becomes rumor, a ghost in the paperwork. Former colleagues claim he was arrested. Others insist he fled west under a false name. But his true legacy remains buried, literally, in the stacks of captured Nazi records, stored in archives across Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union. Somewhere between guilt and grace, between duty and defiance, this man's story survived. Not because he was remembered, but because his ink refused to disappear. Nuremberg, 1946. In the cold courtroom, justice takes the form of translation headsets and paper evidence. Nazi officials sit in the dock, men whose signatures once condemned millions. Their defense is almost always the same. I was following orders. And somewhere in a captured file among the evidence crates lies another signature, the same looping mark that once meant defiance, not obedience. The irony is brutal. The bureaucrats of genocide and the bureaucrat of mercy are judged by the same symbol, the pen. Allied investigators comb through the archives, comparing names, signatures, and orders. Among the countless lists that led to death, they begin to find a small handful that seem to lead nowhere. Canceled transports, unexecuted orders, bureaucratic dead ends. In a memo dated October 1946, one archivist notes, repeated pattern of deliberate administrative obstruction by mid-level SS officer in Berlin, possible moral interference. But that's where the trail ends. The officer's fate remains unknown. His name never enters public record, overshadowed by louder villains and louder heroes. In post-war Germany, those who survived because of lost paperwork faced their own disbelief. When they tried to explain how a Nazi officer had saved them, most were met with silence or suspicion. After all, who would believe that the same machine that killed millions could have hidden a man quietly working to save a few hundred more? A Jewish survivor named Ruth Halperin, interviewed in 1963, recalled, "They said it must have been a mistake, but I know the handwriting. I saw the red line through my name." Meanwhile, the emerging field of Holocaust studies focuses, rightly, on the perpetrators. The world needs clarity, not ambiguity. And so stories like his are omitted, too complicated for a narrative that demands monsters and martyrs, not men who were both. But a few historians notice the gap. In the 1970s, fragments of his documents resurface in the Bundesarchiv, misfiled under personnel deviations. The handwriting matches the signature from the 1946 Allied report. A scholar named Dr. Liesl Kruger, studying administrative resistance, publishes a brief paper titled An Unknown Bureaucrat's War. She writes, "His actions blur the line between guilt and redemption. He operated inside the system, but against its soul. It's the first academic recognition of his existence, though his full identity remains sealed by post-war classification laws. Still, his story raises an unsettling question. If moral resistance could hide inside the Nazi machine, how many others might have done the same, unseen, unsung, unrecorded? The Holocaust left no room for easy morality. There were victims, perpetrators, and the silent millions in between, and somewhere in that gray space stood one man, neither innocent nor entirely guilty, whose weapon was hesitation. Berlin, 1998, the cold. War has ended. The iron doors of Soviet archives are finally opening. Within dusty stacks of captured Nazi documents stored in Moscow's Special Archive, researchers uncover files long thought lost. The Missing Population Office records from 1944 to 45. Inside, they find dozens of transport lists marked with the same familiar red diagonal line, the mark that once meant delay, confusion, life. And finally, a name beneath the signature, Wilhelm Brunner. It's the first confirmed identification of the man historians had called the Ghost Clerk. Brunner's personnel file paints a quiet, almost anonymous portrait. Born 1901, Hamburg. Joined the Nazi Party in 1933. Assigned to administrative service under the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office. A functionary, a cog, nothing remarkable. But the archive tells another story. One written not in ideology, but in ink and hesitation. Over 400 files attributed to Brunner bear irregularities, forged health certificates, false exemptions, duplicated IDs, and canceled deportation orders. Each instance a tiny act of disobedience wrapped in official procedure. For historians, the discovery is staggering. Here was proof that moral resistance could exist inside total obedience, that compassion didn't always wear the uniform of rebellion. In 2001, Dr. Liesl Kruger, now elderly, publishes a follow-up study titled The Clerk Who Said No. Her conclusion is both haunting and humble. Brunner did not overthrow the system. He did not save thousands. But in the heart of the machine, he made it hesitate, and that hesitation was life. Survivors now in their 80s and 90s begin to come forward. A handful remember the confusion, the delays, the cancellations. One woman, Eva Hirsch, claims her father, a doctor from Berlin, was saved by an inexplicable administrative delay in 1944. His file, it turns out, bears Brunner's mark. When told of this discovery in a filmed interview, she pauses and says softly, "He saved my father's life with a stamp." How do you thank a ghost? The story spreads slowly through documentaries, historical journals, and eventually classrooms. Yet it remains uneasy. Brunner was still part of the SS, still a cog in the genocidal bureaucracy he quietly resisted. Some scholars call him a hero, others a paradox. A few refuse to call him anything at all, but the documents don't argue. They simply exist, small, stubborn fragments of humanity inside the machinery of death. In memory of those who, even within the machinery of evil, chose delay over obedience. It bears no names. But among the researchers and archivists who fought to bring his story to light, there's no doubt who it honors. Wilhelm Brunner, a Nazi by title, a saboteur by conscience, a man who fought a silent war not to win, but simply to preserve what remained of his humanity. The story of Wilhelm Brunner ends where it began, in the silence of an office surrounded by paper and order. He left behind no manifesto, no confession, no explanation of why he did what he did. Only the traces of hesitation, red lines through names that were meant to disappear. In that hesitation, we find something profoundly human, the stubborn instinct to resist when resistance seems impossible. Historians often describe the Holocaust as the triumph of system over soul, a place where morality was industrialized, where decisions of life and death became paperwork. But Brunner's story forces us to look closer, because even inside that monstrous order, there were moments, microscopic, almost invisible, where the human spirit refused to vanish completely. When you walk today through Berlin's topography of terror, the museum that stands on the ruins of the SS headquarters, you can still hear the echo of the old system in the creak of the floors. The typewriter clicks in archived recordings. It's easy to imagine that history is built by heroes and tyrants, but in truth, history often pivots on the quiet choices of the unseen: a clerk's delay, a stamp withheld, a file misplaced. Brunner's acts didn't end the Holocaust. They didn't save the world, but they mattered because they proved that even inside the coldest machinery, a flicker of conscience can still burn. In the years since his rediscovery, scholars continue to debate what he represents. Was he a savior trapped in a killer's uniform, or a man trying to redeem himself too late? The answer may not matter. What matters is the reminder he leaves us with, that morality is not declared. It is chosen again and again, often in silence, often unseen. He could not stop the trains. He could not end the war, but he could slow the paper. And in that slowness, that fragile defiance, hundreds of lives found space to breathe. The Nazi who secretly saved Jews through bureaucracy, reminding us that even in the darkest systems there is room for conscience.